For every beloved Dark Souls boss that makes us want to restart the game the second the credits roll, there's one that literally makes everyone quit. Dark Souls is a game of extremes, representing the highest highs and the absolute lowest pits of technical failure. Starting out with an entry that will come as a surprise to absolutely no one, the Bed of Chaos. In a game celebrated for its intricate design, this is a singular glaring exception that remains the ultimate stain on the franchise's legacy. To speak of the Bed of Chaos is to speak of a collective trauma shared by the entire Dark Souls community. It is a boss that abandons every established mechanic, everything the game has taught you about combat, timing, and growth, and replaces it with what can be described as a platforming nightmare in a game that was never designed for platforming. The disappointment is magnified when you consider the lore potential. This is the Witch of Izalith, one of the original lords who stood against the dragons and transformed into a grotesque heart of chaos in a failed attempt to recreate the first flame. The build-up as you descend through the lost city of Izalith, although rushed, suggests a grand apocalyptic confrontation. Instead, you are met with a giant stationary tree bug and a floor that literally crumbles beneath your feet. I cannot count the number of times I felt genuine red-hot frustration as a single sweeping branch swiped me into a bottomless pit. There is no learning the pattern here. There is only a frantic, desperate sprint through a literal minefield of collapsing geometry. It isn't a test of skill. It is a test of patience against a boss that plays by its own broken rules. The fact that your progress saves after you destroy each of 2 glowing orbs is perhaps the most damning evidence of its failure. Even From Software seemed to acknowledge that asking a player to complete this encounter in a single go without dying to a physics glitch was an unreasonable request. When you finally reach the center and kill the pathetic one-hit slug at its heart, you don't feel a sense of triumph. You feel a sense of relief that you never have to set foot in that area again. It is the antithesis of the dodge, hit, heal rhythm we praise in Artorias and Manus boss fights. It is a boss fight that doesn't belong in Dark Souls, and it stands as the undisputed queen of this most hated list. Oh man, I'm getting a bit worked up just thinking about those branches. Anyways, let's move on to something that actually feels earned. Every Dark Souls fan remembers the first time they stepped into a duel that felt like a masterpiece. I still remember the day the Artorias of the Abyss DLC was released. After navigating the absurdly convoluted method From Software designed to even access the portal in Darkroot Basin, I finally stepped into Ulasil. At the time, my skill level was average at best. Even with full Havels and every heavy weapon in my inventory, it was immediately clear that Artorias was built differently. He wasn't like the slower, human-sized opponents we had fought previously. His incredible movement, the airborne plunges, and the front flip slams were genuinely intimidating, for me at least. And this was the fight that led me to look deeper into the game's story in the first place. Artorias represented the peak of boss design in Dark Souls 1. This begins with the arena itself. The Ulasil Colosseum is a flat, open circle. There are no pillars to hide behind and no environmental hazards to worry about. It's a design choice that strips away all the cheap gimmicks. You can't trap him behind geometry or bait him into a pit. It's a pure test of your ability to dodge, block, and find openings in a 1v1 setting. By the time you reach this fog gate, the game has spent hours building Artorias up as a legendary hero, one of Gwyn's 4 knights tasked with halting the spread of the Abyss. But the reality is much clearer. The town of Ulasil unearthed an ancient darkness, awakening Manus, and Artorias was the one who went in to stop him. But unfortunately, he failed. The most meaningful detail in this fight is his physical state. Artorias used his great shield to protect his young companion, Sif, leaving his own left arm to be shattered by the darkness. When you fight him, his left arm hangs limply and uselessly at his side. He's fighting you with his non-dominant hand while his mind is lost to madness. I have always had a suspicion that they programmed his movements and tracking to emulate this. At first, it looks like erratic tracking, but then he suddenly delivers a blow from across the arena. It is also impossible to talk about Artorias without mentioning Kentaro Miura's Berserk. Hidetaka Miyazaki's love for the manga is well documented, and Artorias is essentially a walking tribute to the series protagonist, Guts. The visual parallels are striking, from the iconic pose on the DLC cover art to the way he stands with his sword resting on his shoulder. But the influence goes deeper than just the look. The way Artorias fights, the somersaulting slams and the feral animalistic aggression are a direct nod to Guts in the Berserker armor. Like Guts, Artorias is a struggler who pushed his body past its breaking point, continued to fight even as his limbs were shattered and his mind was consumed by darkness. When you see him flipping through the air despite his broken arm, you are seeing that Miura-inspired beast of darkness in motion. Another striking part about Artorias is how much he feels like a future boss. If you go from fighting the slow, predictable Iron Golem to this, it's a total shock. He moves at the speed of a Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring boss, while you are stuck with Dark Souls 1 movement. From Software's choice to include 3 versions of its sword is one of the coolest details in the game. You have the 2 versions made from Sif's soul and the Abyss Greatsword made from Artorias' own soul. These weapons allow us to feel how he would have battled in his prime versus how he fights now. Beating Artorias is a hollow victory in the best way possible. When you defeat him, you are finishing the mission he started. Elizabeth and Dusk give us the incentive to succeed where he could not, but there is a heavy feeling to it. You are putting a hero to rest so his honor remains intact. It's an incredible high-stakes dodge-and-hit rhythm that makes you feel like a pro, but unfortunately the same cannot be said for the glitchy, eye-straining mess that is the Centipede Demon. Directly preceding the frustration of the Bed of Chaos is an encounter that serves as the perfect prologue to the mechanical failure of Lost Izalith, the Centipede Demon. While it may not possess the same legendary level of infamy as the Bed of Chaos, it is hated for a much more fundamental reason. It is a fight against the game's own technical limitations. The most immediate issue with the Centipede Demon is the arena itself. You are funneled into a narrow, cramped strip of land surrounded by a lake of lava that drains your health in seconds. I have remembered the sheer claustrophobia of my first attempt. Because the boss is so massive, the camera frequently loses its target or clips through the boss's textures entirely. When you are fighting a beast of this scale, your primary source of information is visual telegraphs. However, in this encounter, the camera often ends up buried in the creature's midsection or stuck behind a wall of fire. It is infuriating to take massive damage from an attack you couldn't even see coming because the game's engine figures out where to place your perspective. The Centipede Demon is a hated boss because its difficulty is artificial. The encounter essentially forces a gear check on the player. If you haven't secured the orange charred ring, which ironically you get by cutting off this boss's tail or defeating it, the lava makes the arena nearly unnavigable. In my first playthrough, I had no idea that you can simply obtain the ring by just cutting off its tail, so I had to struggle through the entire fight with the arena and getting roasted in the lava, only to obtain the ring after defeating it. A more clever design would be to let the players obtain this ring from a hidden wall or a more hidden location. But From Software decided to instead let us obtain the ring from the boss itself. Its arena is where the ring is needed the most. I found the mechanic of the fight to be a chaotic mess of flailing limbs and clipping issues. There is no dance here, only a desperate scramble to find solid ground where the boss's own model doesn't obscure you. It feels like a leftover asset from a rushed development cycle, a creature that was never properly scaled for the room it was placed in. Ultimately, the Centipede Demon is hated because it represents the moment Dark Souls loses its meticulous polish. After the architectural majesty of Anno Londo and the atmospheric dread of New Londo, being forced into a glitchy, eye-straining fight against a flickering camera feels beneath the standards of the game. You don't defeat the Centipede Demon through mastery. You defeat it by surviving the technical jank long enough to deplete its health bar. I'm honestly getting a headache just thinking about that lava bloom, but let's switch gears to a fight that actually respects Artorias' bravery. Artorias' bravery didn't die with him. It lived on in the companion he sacrificed everything to save. To reach Sif, you have to venture into the deepest part of the Darkroot Forest. The arena is a secluded grove centered around a massive gravestone marked by a sword that dwarfs the player. It is a quiet, overgrown monument to a fallen hero. Unlike other bosses that feel like they are hunting you, Sif is simply here to guard her master's final resting place. She isn't an obstacle for the sake of being an obstacle. She's a guardian trying to prevent anyone else from being consumed by the abyss like Artorias was. There is a detail in the arena that often gets overlooked. The sheer number of swords stuck in the ground around the grave. They represent the hundreds of other undead who came before you, trying to do exactly what you are doing, to steal the ring and challenge the abyss. Every sword is a failed challenger that Sif had to put down, not for the sake of killing or sport, but for their own good. The most frustrating part about the fight with Sif isn't the difficulty. It's the fact that it's mandatory to fight her. To progress through the late game and face the four kings in New Londo, you need the Covenant of Artorias, a ring that allows you to traverse the abyss without being consumed, and Sif is the one holding it. This creates a different kind of tension compared to the other bosses. Usually, you kill a boss because they are an aggressor or a monster blocking your path. But in the case of Sif, you are the aggressor. You are essentially grave robbing a hero's resting place. The game forces you into this position where you either kill her or the credits never roll. If you choose to do the Ulasil DLC before facing Sif, your perspective on her character shifts completely. In the Chasm of the Abyss, you find Sif as a young pup, trapped and surrounded by humanity sprites. If you rescue her, you can actually summon her to help you fight Manus, Father of the Abyss. If you go ahead and face Sif after rescuing her, an alternative cutscene plays, where Sif recognizes your scent, she appreciates you, and she lets out a mournful howl. She remembers that you saved her life in the past, but she still picks up the sword. It's tragic how she doesn't want to fight you, but she has to stop you from sharing Artorias' fate. Usually, when a boss's health falls below a certain point, it becomes more aggressive or enters a second phase. But in the case of Sif, she begins to limp. The animations of her attacks getting slower and her being unable to fight shift the tone of the encounter. You can even see her occasionally tripping and struggling to lift Artorias' massive greatsword. She is just holding on to her blade. When I first saw this, I did not feel like the hero, but instead felt like the enemy. It made me realize that in a game where you are fighting monsters, oftentimes you are the monster yourself, killing innocent beings to fulfill your desires. And the score of this fight is what really seals the tragedy. It doesn't start with a booming brass or aggressive violence. Instead, it starts with a single high-pitched female vocal lead, then transitioning to the choir. It creates a sense of isolation and melancholy. Even if you have not looked into a single item description or don't know anything about the bond between Sif and Artorias, that music tells the story for you. It feels like a funeral that makes the arena feel less like a boss room and more like a graveyard. I'm getting a little bit choked up just thinking about that howl, honestly. It's a masterpiece of storytelling, but unfortunately the same cannot be said for the absolute lack of imagination in our next entry. It is no coincidence that 3 of the most hated bosses on this list originate from the same location. The Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith represent a collapse in the game's legendary quality control, and the Firesage is the most transparent example of that decline. What makes the Demon Firesage so uniquely irritating is the sheer lack of imagination behind its inclusion. By the time you reach this fog gate, you've already fought this exact boss twice. It is a literal reskin of the Asylum Demon and the Stray Demon. After trekking through a landscape of lava and ruins, expecting a unique challenge that justifies the journey, being met with the same oversized demon you fought in the tutorial, only now set on fire, feels like a slap in the face. It is copy-paste difficulty in its purest form. While the Stray Demon offered a legitimate optional challenge for those returning to the Undead Asylum, placing a third version of the same model as a mandatory roadblock in the late game feels desperate. It shatters the immersion and reminds the player that they are simply playing through a rushed development cycle. The fight itself adds nothing new to the conversation. It uses the same grounded pounds and the same sweeping strikes as its predecessors. The only innovation here is a fire-based AoE that deals magic damage. I remember the annoyance of trying to find a rhythm in a fight I had already mastered hours ago, only to get caught by the wonky hitboxes of its AoE blasts. There is no sense of discovery or growth when you defeat the Firesage. You aren't learning a new mechanic, you are performing a repetitive task you have already completed. It lacks the personality of the bosses we love and the brutal, intentional designs of the ones we hate. The boss in its entirety is not bad, but the fact that it's the third reskin makes the fight boring. The Demon Firesage stands as a monument to the quantity over quality seen in the second half of the game. It is a boss that exists solely to take up space, to pad the length of the demon ruins, and to provide a bridge to an even more disastrous bed of chaos. When you finally put it down, there is no adrenaline, no feeling of, I finally did it. There is only a weary sigh and the realization that the game's creativity has hit a brick wall. It is the final uninspired nail in the coffin of Lost Izalith's reputation. I'm honestly getting bored just talking about him, so let's move on to a fight that is actually the fight that started the entire tragedy of Ulasil, which is Manus, who is a complete departure from the nightly duels we see elsewhere, or the typical large boss. He is the father of the Abyss, a primeval human whose humanity went wild after the people of Ulasil unearthed and tortured him. Long before you arrived, the people of Ulasil were tricked by a toothy serpent, likely Kath, into upturning the grave of a primeval man, and in the process they woke him up, and when he did, he found his pendant to be missing, and was eventually driven into a beastly frenzy as his dark soul went wild, transforming him into the father of the Abyss. The lore reveals that Manus was assaulted and tortured in the dungeons of Ulasil. His mind pushed to the brink by sorcerers who used illusory magic to twist his perception of reality. I think about that every time I enter the arena. The Abyss isn't just a place, it's the manifestation of rage, a man who was never allowed to die in peace. The only thing keeping him tethered was a small pendant, a memento of a time where he knew love. When that was taken, the last of his humanity snapped. I felt a genuine weight to this part of the story because it makes the boss feel less like an obstacle and more like a mourning soul. Dusk of Ulasil confirms this when she speaks of her time as his prisoner.
I still think on that creature from the abyss that preyed upon me. My faculties were far from lucid, but I quite clearly sensed certain emotions. A wrenching nostalgia, a lost joy, an object of obsession, and a sincere hope to reclaim it. Could these thoughts belong to the beast from the abyss? But if that were true, then perhaps it is no beast after all.
When I see his design, the tragedy of that transformation is immediate. He is a massive beast-like humanoid, but it's the disproportionate features that stick with me. His head has no eyes or ears. Instead, 11 red eyes are scattered across his horns, 6 on the left and 5 on the right. His transformation is primal and chaotic, featuring twisted wooden protrusions that would become a recurring theme in the series. Most notably, his massive furry left arm is a direct predecessor to the design of the cleric Beast, the first boss of Bloodborne. The way he uses that limb to sweep the arena and bridge the gap between him and the player is a clear blueprint for the faster, more aggressive art direction From Software would take years later. I love the high fantasy aspect of this encounter. Your journey through a dying land to save a princess from a terrifying beast. It really brings out the atmosphere of a typical fantasy trope for me. But the combat is where Manus truly stands out. He, alongside Artorias, laid the base foundation for most of the modern bosses you see From Software make. He is hyper-aggressive, unlike the slower, more telegraphed bosses in the base game. I can't even remember the number of times his insane 5-hit combo caught me. If you mistime a single roll or let your guard down for a second, that's the end of your run. That's it, you die. He felt like a complete shift in philosophy compared to the bosses in the base game. Manus matches the relentless pace of later From Software titles that high-stakes dodge, hit, heal rhythm, where one mistake can snowball into a game-over screen. It is a brilliant tactical shift to see him use abyssal magic around half health. What I really love about this encounter is the silver pendant. It acts as a unique deflecting tool to counter his abyss magic, like the Abyss Rain or the Abyss Cage that traps you from all sides. Knowing this was the same tool Artorias once used adds so much weight to the fight. I love that the game doesn't simply give it to you. If you explore enough to stumble across it, you are rewarded with a way to even the odds. Timing the pendant's pulse to blast away the dark feels incredible. It turns a chaotic magic spam into a manageable rhythmic duel. Then there is the summon for Sif. If you explored the chasm and saved the young wolf from the humanity phantoms earlier, his sign appears right here on the floor of the boss room. Seeing that small, translucent wolf jump into the fight alongside me is easily one of my favorite moments in the game. Sif doesn't do much damage, no, but having him there to distract Manus during the magic-heavy second phase is incredibly helpful. It really does feel like a true partnership. Since you summon him after entering the fog, it doesn't increase Manus' health pool. Watching Sif hop around, dodging the same beast that broke his master Artorias, adds a layer of closure to the DLC that you just don't get with other bosses. It makes the victory shared. It's a legendary partnership that makes the struggle worth it. But while Manus is a fair test of skill, the same cannot be said for the absolute prank that is our next entry, which is a boss that arguably caused more rage quits than any other in the early game. The Capra Demon. This encounter is hated not because the boss itself is particularly complex, but because it feels like a deliberate claustrophobic trap designed to kill you before you even realize the fight has started. I cannot count the number of times I walked through that narrow fog gate in the lower undead burg, only to be dead within 5 seconds. The arena is essentially a tiny, cramped closet, and the game immediately jams you between the boss's massive dual machetes and two of the most hated enemies in the entire franchise, the undead dogs. The dogs are the real boss here. Their speed and ability to stun lock you the moment you enter the arena is what makes this fight feel so inherently unfair. I remember the pure, unadulterated salt of being blocked by the dog's hitbox in that tiny corner, unable to move, while the Capra Demon brought both blades down on my head. It feels way less like a fair challenge and more like the game is just playing a prank on you. What makes this encounter truly hated is that the most viable strategy for most players isn't to master the combat, but to exploit the arena's geometry. Almost everyone ends up doing the same thing, sprinting for that narrow stone staircase on the left, praying the dogs don't clip them, and then standing on the ledge to cheese the AI. When a boss fight forces the majority of the player base to rely on a plunging attack loop or throwing the firebombs over the fog walls just to avoid the frustration of the entry, you know the design has failed. There is no grace in this victory, there's no learning the dance, there's only the relief of finally killing those dogs and realizing that the demon itself is actually quite pathetic once you have more than 2 inches of breathing room. I'm honestly getting a little bit tilted just thinking about those dogs, but thankfully we can move on to the fight that represents the absolute summit of the entire Dark Souls experience. We've arrived at the legendary duo of Anor Londo, Ornstein and Smough. This is the pinnacle of a duo boss fight created by From Software. When critics argue that From Software has struggled to replicate the perfect duo fight in modern titles, this is the benchmark against which all others fail. The brilliance of this encounter and the reason it remains an unrepeated masterpiece lies in its foundational design. Unlike the duo fights in Elden Ring like Godskin Duo, which often feel like two independent enemies or bosses haphazardly placed in a room, Ornstein and Smough were built as a singular cohesive machine. The contrast is as mechanical as it is visual. Smough is a lumbering executioner possessing a hammer capable of shattering the player with a single mistimed roll. He is slow, but he commands the space. Conversely, Ornstein is hyper-aggressive, possessing a dash attack that can traverse the entire length of the hall in a heartbeat. They create a perfect push and pull dynamic. One boss forces you to maintain mobility, while the other punishes you for staying still. It is a balancing act that ensures the player is never overwhelmed by overlapping, identical attacks, but is instead caught in a rhythmic struggle for positioning. I recall the immense frustration I felt during my initial attempts, particularly with Smough's shovel-charged attack. The way he lowers his golden hammer and bulldozes across the floor felt insurmountable until I understood the importance of the arena itself. The broken pillars are not decorative. They are essential tactical tools. By using the environment to clip Smough's pathing, the player creates a fleeting window to engage with Ornstein. This requirement for spatial awareness makes the victory feel earned through intellect rather than just reflexes. The transition to the second phase remains one of my favorite instances of environmental storytelling. The game offers a rare reward for the player's choice. Killing either combatant grants the survivor new powers, yet the animations of these transitions are what truly highlights the attention to detail. If Ornstein falls first, Smough shows no grief, callously crushing his partner's body to absorb his lightning. However, if Smough is defeated first, Ornstein places a solemn, respectful hand on his fallen comrade before growing to a gargantuan size. It is a subtle touch that adds layers to their characters without a single word of dialogue. There is also a fascinating narrative layer to consider regarding Ornstein's presence here. I've always been drawn to the theory that the Ornstein we fight in Anor Londo is merely a high-level illusion maintained by Gwyn. This theory gained significant weight with the release of Dark Souls 3, where we find his discarded armor at the Archdragon Peak. It suggests that the real Dragon Slayer actually abandoned his post long ago to seek out the Nameless King. For me, overcoming this duo represents the absolute summit of the experience. After enduring the depths of Blighttown and the traps of Sen's fortress, standing over the remains of the Dragon Slayer and the Executioner feels like reaching the top of a mountain. Receiving the Lord Vessel from Guinevere following this battle changes the very nature of the game. You are no longer a lost undead, but a legitimate candidate for the mantle of Lord. I also think this section would be incomplete if I did not mention Solaire of Astora. In my first playthrough, when the odds felt entirely stacked against me, his golden summon sign on the cathedral stairs was a beacon of hope. He served as the ultimate shield, distracting one giant just long enough for me to deal with the other. That victory in Anor Londo is an incredibly high that defines the whole game. But as we know with Dark Souls, for every masterpiece, there's a complete and utter joke waiting around the corner. While other entries on this list are hated for being unfair or glitchy, Pinwheel earned his spot for the opposite reason. He is a complete and utter joke. What makes Pinwheel a hated boss is the staggering gap between his lore and his actual threat level. This is an entity that stole the power of Gravelord Nito, a necromancer experimenting with the very fabric of life and death to reunite a fractured family represented by the three masks of the father, mother, and child. The catacombs are a harrowing, lightless trek filled with regenerating skeletons and explosive skulls, leading you to expect a climax that matches the dread of the journey. Instead, you drop into the arena and realize you are fighting a boss that can be folded in 3 or 4 hits by any reasonably upgraded weapon. I remember the genuine confusion I felt during my first playthrough. I was braced for a fight of my life, only to watch his health bar evaporate before he could even finish his first teleportation animation. There is no tension, no stakes, and certainly no dance. Pinwheel is essentially a glass cannon that forgot to bring the cannons. He tries to create clones of himself and fire slow-moving projectiles, but his poise is so non-existent that almost any attack staggers him out of his casting frame. The fight ends before it even begins. It's an encounter that feels like it belongs in the first 10 minutes of the game, yet it's tucked away in one of the most dangerous zones in Lordran. I hate this fight because it feels like a wasted opportunity. The visual design of the three-faced necromancer is haunting, and the arena, cluttered with books and macabre experiments. It's incredibly atmospheric, but all of that is undermined by a boss that poses less of a threat than the wheel skeletons you had to dodge just to get to his fog gate. Pinwheel is a total anticlimax that leaves you feeling empty. But thankfully, we have one final encounter that brings back the emotion, a challenge, and the somber reality of this dying world. After the high-octane aggression of Manus and the grand spectacle of Ornstein and Smough, the encounter with Gwyn is a deliberate, somber subversion of expectations. The atmosphere of this fight is arguably the most poignant in the entire trilogy. When I first stepped through the final fog gate, I expected a triumphant orchestral score to mark the end of my journey. Instead, I was met with Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, a melancholic piano piece that instantly reframes the entire conflict. It isn't a battle for glory, it is mercy killing. Gwyn's design reinforces this tragedy. He isn't the towering, lightning-wielding deity seen in the opening cinematic. He is charred, his robes are tattered, and his eyes are vacant. He is the Lord of Cinder, not the Lord of Cinder-to-be, and the realization that he sacrificed everything, his family, his status, and his very soul, to prolong an age that was destined to end, makes the fight feel deeply personal. Mechanically speaking, Gwyn is a fascinating challenge. He is notoriously aggressive, leaping across the arena the moment you enter to keep him on the defensive. I struggled immensely with his quick horizontal slashes. His speed is a final test of everything you have learned about stamina management and timing. However, there is one mechanical flaw, or perhaps a deliberate design choice, that defines this fight, which is his vulnerability to parrying. While some argue that being able to parry the final boss makes him too easy, I find it to be a masterpiece of narration integration. Parrying is a skill that the player has been forced to hone throughout the game, and to use it against a god feels like the ultimate democratization of power. It highlights just how far Gwyn has fallen. The man who once hunted dragons can now be brought to his knees by a simple, well-timed deflection from a lowly undead. As the final blow lands and the music fades into silence, the weight of the choice ahead becomes overwhelming. Standing over the remains of the man who started it all, I felt a profound sense of exhaustion and accomplishment. Whether you choose to link the fire and continue Gwyn's cycle, or walk away to usher in the Age of Dark, the victory remains one of the most resonant moments in gaming history. After you've settled the score with Gwyn and dragged yourself through the chaos of Izalith, sometimes you don't want another boss fight. You just want to stay. To linger in Lordran a little longer. To let the music hum, the fire crackle, the wind move through empty cathedrals without something trying to kill you every 30 seconds. And the truth is, we've only scratched the surface. Beneath the bosses and item descriptions is an absurd amount of hidden lore, strange development decisions, cut mechanics, unused dialogue, and details most players never even notice. So instead of fighting, we're exploring. For the next couple of hours, we will be peeling back the layers of Dark Souls piece by piece. So here are 2 hours of Dark Souls facts to chill to.